Hey everybody, this is Alan Ting, TEDx speaker, #1 bestselling author. Today's talk, it's all about the 3 secrets of no yelling fatherhood. The end goal of this talk, you're going to learn 3 things. #1, the end goal is to learn what are the 3 negative effects of yelling. Second, you're going to learn what are 3 actions to get your kids to listen to you. Because I think the byproduct of yelling, right? Why do we yell? Is because we want our kids to listen. And #3, we're going to talk about how to get more support. All right, so with that said, let's get things started. Why do we yell at our kids? What's the purpose? So think about the end goal. We get frustrated, we get tired. How we feel also determines our state. If we're in a good state, meaning that we're happy, that we feel good, we feel recharged. Is there correlation between that and maybe yelling a little bit less? Typical reasons why parents yell, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is the kids are misbehaving. Either that or the repeated behavior. It's like, I told you for the nth time that go clean up your room, or I told you the nth time to make sure you make your bed. So you repeat things over and over and over, and then the kids don't listen. And when the kids don't listen, then we yell. And then that's maybe for some parents. And then the other parents might be like, I have a throttling process. What that means is I'm going to ask them to make their bed first, nicely. And if they don't listen, then I'm going to ask repeat again. And if they don't listen again, I'm going to nag, could you please go clean up your room? And if they don't listen, resort back to yelling, please go clean up your room, right? So that's the throttling up method. At the end of the day, we're equally frustrated, right? Those are some of the typical process of why, it's pretty interesting. Looking on Facebook, I'm just kind of gathering some data. Here's a definition from Einstein. He says the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So I want to talk about the three negative effects of trauma. And recently, I went to a trauma conference, did a virtual event in Boston, and one of the things they talked about was brain development. I would like to invite you to write this down. Critical age for children is between 3 to 14 years old. So what that means is that we have a period of time where we can set that foundation. And part of that foundation is both positive parenting and also negative parenting. Right? Depends on how we parent. Before we start, I just want to talk about, we're approaching this from an evidence-based and science-backed perspective of parenting. So if things that do come up, maybe you feel like there's blaming involved or shaming involved, that's not what we do here. I just want to throw this out there that we're not here to blame or shame any parents. All we're doing is focusing on what science have to say, and evidence-based have to say. And the most important goal is how can we parent even better? Here's what I've learned. One of the things what the scientists did was they scanned the MRI brain. Here's a chart, here's a scan of the hippocampus, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So Stanford Medicine, what they did was they compared 16 young people who had PTSD with a control group about 11 normal youth. And what they did was they scanned the brains between 10 years old to 17-year-old subjects. And all they did was a simple test of verbal memory. So for example, the subjects had to learn a list of words, and they saw similar lists with new words added. And then what they were asked to do was ask which terms were presented on the original list. So this is the old, this is the new, and what's the difference, right? Noticing the difference. So here's what's really interesting about that. The hippocampus worked equally well with stressed and controlled subjects when the words list was introduced. And here gets what's really interesting. Some of these subjects with PTSD syndromes made more errors on the recall part of the test, and they show less hippocampus activities than control subjects during the same link or the same task. So if you look at going back to the brain, right, part of the hippocampus, people without stress or PTSD, that part gets lit up. And then the folks who have PTSD, these trauma, that hippocampus part, they don't get activated as much. So what that means is, if you guys are not familiar with hippocampuses, is basically that part of the brain is our library, right? So like a big library. Think about a librarian. They're there to be able to access part of your brain, remember things like, your birthday party or when you're learning how to ride a bike. So that's what hippocampus does. And part of that brain takes all that important information and the events and stores them in that special book so that they can go back and remember later. But what happened was with trauma patients, so the left brain, obviously we know it's a logical brain, right? So it keeps track of the timeline. The right brain is more of the artistic brain. So what happened is during trauma processes, person that had experienced trauma, they don't recall anything of the past of that trauma. They only recall that incident in the moment. where they experience trauma over and over and over and over again. And what that looks like, a lot of times when you talk to people, especially adults, you're like, my life is over. There's no point in trying out. So they stuck in this victim mode, or they stuck in this self-helplessness mode. And then what happens is this typical norm, right? The process, we're looking at patterns. What they do is they start pointing fingers. So immediately, it's not my fault. It can't be my fault. So it's my dad's fault for yelling at me. It's my mom's fault for punishing me. And they start pointing fingers. And how that transpires in the workplace is when anytime something goes wrong, they start pointing fingers at other people as well. They never take accountability. They never take self-inventory. They never say it's yes, I made a mistake, but it's always everybody else's fault. And then once their brain gets unhijacked, right, they go back into the normal state, then they go back into their everyday life. But when they do get hijacked, they get triggered, they start pointing fingers, and those are a very common problem. What happened is when we yell, so if you guys haven't seen the correlation now, is when we yell enough, when we stimulate that part of the brain enough, hippocampus, we're going to remember part of that trauma, and that trauma replays in our brain over and over and over again. So ask anybody who has PTSD, like war veterans or even children with younger trauma, they're going to tell that same story over and over and over again. It's because that impairment of hippocampus has a strong correlation with avoidance and numbing. Avoidance and numbing. So they push away, avoid, because they don't want more pain, and then numbing because it hurts so bad they just don't want to talk about it. Like seeing some of these people, they live in this bubble, or they live in the old world. Or also that could be, somebody could be aloof, meaning like they're mentally checked out. So those are some of the telltale signs of PTSD or past trauma. Again, they're having a difficult time remembering trauma and feeling cut off from others, and they feel lack of emotion. Dads and moms, this is a game changer, because how I was brought up was my parents, especially my mom, said, you have to be very strict with your kids when they're very young, because if you don't, then when they grow up, then, it's harder to control them. To a certain degree, I agree with her, but the challenge is that, remember, our brain is still developing from the time they were born all the way up to they're 25 years old. The prefrontal cortex, executive decision part of our brain right here, that's still developing. Unfortunately, I didn't learn about this until way later when my daughter was older, maybe like 4. And that when I learned this, it clicked on me. So part of the challenge of me giving this talk today is because we have dads with all different age group. I would say that between the age of 0 to 3, 0 to 4, when kids are throwing tantrums, they're crying bloody murdered, it's really not their fault. It's because they can't control their prefrontal cortex, their decisioning process, the emotional part. They can't control this part right here. I didn't understand this part until my daughter was about 4 years old. And then I realized, oh my gosh, once I understood this, because part of our brain, her brain is still developing, I can appreciate that. And through that process came understanding. And through understanding, I came to have more patience. That makes sense for everybody? When your kids are flipping out, remember this part right here. The prefrontal cortex is developing. Now, for kids that are after 3 to 4 years old, remember I talked about the critical age is between 3 to 14. So this is still really important because their brain is still developing. So we're going to talk about how to yell less, how to take really the trauma process, how to be even more patient, take this trauma process out of our daily lives. All right, so that's number 1 for the effects of yelling. Number 2 effects of yelling is what happened is a lot of times when we yell, very often, we come to have what's called fixed mindset. So if you guys are not familiar with fixed mindset, this is created by Carol Dweck. She identified Stanford psychology that what happened is when we yell, remember we talked about avoidance, right? And we mentally checked out. And what that points to is fixed mindset. 5 things. Number 1, what fixed mindset is really about is number 1, it avoids challenges. So any new task, any new things, for example, if your kid is 3rd grade, by the time they should learn multiplication tables by now, or pretty comfortable with it, they start learning divisions, long form divisions. If they can't learn that easily, they start avoiding challenges. They don't want to learn it. So if you guys want your kids to learn even faster, try not to yell, okay? Because it points to fixed mindset. There's a high correlation between that. Number 2, what happened is when we yell a lot, the kids are like, you know what? I can't do this. I'm not smart enough. So what do? They give up really easily. And the 3rd thing is once they give up really easy, they're like, you know what? What's the point of doing all this anyways? Math isn't for me. In fact, one of my clients I'm working with right now, she's older. She's also a teacher. All this, when we start working together, all this memories start coming back when she was younger. Because, it got to a point where even in high school, she was not doing well in math and she wanted to go to college. And here's what her mom said. Again, this is not coming from shame or blame. It's understanding the mom doesn't know better, that she doesn't know the stuff that we know now, or she hasn't taken these courses. Mom came back and says, you know what, honey, I don't want to disappoint you. I don't want to disappoint yourself. You're better off being a hairdresser. Don't worry about going to college. That's not for you. The good thing about her is she had growth mindset. Somehow, some way she developed growth mindset. And she's like, you know what? I'm more than that. I'm more than a hairdresser. Again, nothing wrong with being a hairdresser, but I feel like I have this mental capacity to be even more. She went on her college and then she became a teacher. She went on to master. What happens when we yell, we put in that fixed mindset, geared towards fixed mindset towards our kids. And then the other part is because we yell so much, remember the part we talked about, the brain becomes numb. So they start ignoring negative feedback. So anytime we give them feedback, they start ignoring, like, you know what? I just don't want to hear it. You ever work with people, like when you try to give them honest, constructive feedback because you really care about them, you're like, I don't care. I don't want to hear it. They just tune out, right? How many of you guys? And then the worst part is when they see other people being successful, they're like, you know what? They either become jealous or they feel threatened by other people's success. So that's the definition of fixed mindset. Ultimately, that really leads to is disconnection and having low self-esteem.